Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Limin. He comes to us from the University of Delaware, and I'll just say one thing. That is, he's the nation's expert in inoculants. So I look forward to hearing what he's going to tell us today. And with that, Dr. Kung, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Am I on? Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Limin, Animal Nutrition, and University of Nebraska Extension for planning this meeting and inviting me out today. So thanks, folks, wherever you guys are, Renato, everybody. Great. Okay. I had the task of talking about inoculants for small grain silage, and I'm really going to talk about inoculants in general. I don't have my slides in the proceedings. I actually have a review that I wrote. But if you would like to have a copy of these slides, just let the organizers know and I can get them a copy. It's on there. You can pass it out to everybody if they need it, okay? So let's see here. Okay, so here are the topics for discussion today. We're going to talk about silage fermentations, good and bad, and we've already, previous speakers have done a really great job in characterizing some of this before me. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I'll give you a little different insight and some numbers. We'll talk about bacterial inoculants in general, the different types and why you should use them and what they were meant to do. And then we're going to talk about actually something that most people don't think about is how do you, if you decide on using an inoculant, how do you manage the inoculants to make sure that you can get the best bang for your buck? Because you paid a lot for these inoculants. You want to make sure that the inoculants are really going to be effective, or at least effective most of the time. All right. So the goals of making silage for me: recovery of nutrients, maximize it. That was hit before, and create a stable product. Sorry, that got a little cut off there, but a stable product that resists spoiling once it's stored. So it's almost like, you make a good cake. You're not going to eat it all in one day. You want to have it keep well for 2 or 3 days so that you can enjoy it for a while, right? So that's kind of the concept here. Make a really good cake and make sure that it'll last for a little while so that you can enjoy it. So just think about that with the nutrients and your dry matter that you have within your silo, okay? So before I even get into inoculants, I have to remind you that, and I think most of you know this already, that the quality that you start with at harvest and what you do with it and how you manage it later during the siling, storage, and feed out process, these are the items that really control silage quality at feed out, right? So if, I'm a dairy guy, so at dairy meetings, I always tell guys, well, look, if you're going to harvest black layer corn silage and it's 52%, that's what you got, right? I don't care what you process. I don't care what inoculant you put on. I don't care how fine you chop it or how long you chop it. You got some pretty bad corn silage. And are your cows going to milk on it? No. It's because of what you started with, okay? Now, so having said that, I know that everybody on every farm and at every cutting that you have, at every harvest, you may have different objectives for that crop, that cutting, or for certain parts of your acreage for that cutting, right? You may have something, this is dry cow feed. This is super high producing cow feed. Okay, you have to have the highest quality if it's dry cow feed. No, you're probably looking for tonnage. My high producing cows in my high group that are at 130 pounds a day, do I need to have the best forage quality? Absolutely yes. End of discussion, okay? But so there's a little compromise that you have to take depending on what your goals are for your farm and for that cutting and what your needs are for the animal. But certainly what you start with at harvest and how you manage it, which people have talked about before, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the management, they definitely set the stage for what you've got coming out of the silo. And remember, silage additives, and I'm going to talk primarily about bacterial inoculants, they're a tool that you can use, but they are not a substitute for good silage management. And, if your silos look like this, and, there are other pretty good pictures of bad silos, lots of pictures of bad silos today, right? You need to kind of fix your management first and then think about inoculants, because the inoculants aren't going to save you and they're not going to turn this stuff into gold, okay? All right. So let's talk about the type of fermentations that can occur in a silo, because people have talked about fermentations, and we know that there are different types of fermentations, and they're not all the same. They're different in silo to silo, crop to crop, year to year. So what I'm going to show you are some numbers, and there's a lot of numbers on and writing on this slide, but I'll get you through this. I'm going to show you types of fermentations. I'm going to talk about the end products that they make, and I'm going to talk to you through percent dry matter energy recovery. And these numbers are kind of theoretical, but you'll see what the take home is in a second. So we have fermentations like this, and like this, and like this. Okay. Take a look at these fermentations and look at the percent dry matter and energy recovery here. Some of them, like ethanol, so like if you're making gasohol, man, there's a really 99% energy recovery from converting the sugars into ethanol. So is that good? For the gasohol guy, that's really good. But what are you feeding your animals? You're feeding dry matter and you're feeding energy. So if you only conserved energy, but you lost 50% of your dry matter, that's not very good for a ruminant animal, okay? And then you can see other fermentations that have dry matter and energy recoveries that are even worse than probably an ethanol fermentation. Then we have fermentations that are by heterolactic acid bacteria, and we have those by homolactic acid bacteria. Okay, so in general, the top three types of fermentations are kind of poor, right? If you then look at the bottom fermentations here and here, one of the things you can see is that these fermentations here are better than here. And one of the ways that you can kind of take home in your mind to remember about why are these bad fermentations bad is look at this common end product that we have here. Okay, what's that? Carbon dioxide. What's carbon dioxide? Solid, liquid, or gas? It's a gas. So where does it go? Boom, into the atmosphere. But where did the carbon come from? The carbon is your dry matter that you've lost. So that's a common theme. Poor fermentations or anything that's making a lot of CO2, you are losing dry matter and value of your crop into the atmosphere, not feeding it to the animal and converting it into milk or meat, if you're a beef guy, right? Okay. So we have the best fermentation, which is called homolactic acid fermentation, gives you the best combination of dry matter and energy recovery. So this is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk. We're going to talk about the differences between homolactic and heterolactic fermentations and how they can really help to drive that fermentation so that you have a more efficient and more economic end product to feed your animals. Okay. I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs that have this same format. I've got the early phases of fermentation, which I call active fermentation here. So this is when, like when you're making wine or pickles or whatever, everything's kind of bubbling, things are moving around. So that's when things are really active. And eventually, you end up with a stable product, right, during storage and feed out. So all my slides for the next 3 slides are going to look like this. This is what a good fermentation with good storage conditions look like, okay? So no air, so that's important. Air is the worst enemy. Oxygen, worst enemy of silage, right? Becky already said that. I have sugars, they disappear over time. Lactic acid goes up, pH drops, and I get a little bit of acetic acid. Okay. One of the biggest things that you have to realize that in a really good fermentation, you see how this stuff moves here and it's changing in the early stages of fermentation, and then it kind of plateaus. The quicker you can get that to plateau and the faster the fermentation can be, the more dry matter and energy you save. So it is really important to have this fermentation process occur as quickly as possible and stabilize as long as possible. Now, during storage and feed out, if I keep the air out of the system, I kind of don't see anything else changing. And that's good. That's stable. Remember, Geza told you that he saw silage that was like 20 years old or something, right? It looks the same as it was the day before, the day that it was made, because they kept the air out of the system. And that product then was completely stable for years, for decades. Silage can stay stable, all right? And what else do we see? We see a little heating. So what's happening in here in this heating stage? Well, heat is what? Energy, and they're probably blowing off a little bit CO2. So I'm losing a little bit of my dry matter in the early fermentation stages. And again, my goal is that if I can get this to occur as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible and reach the stable state, I'll have a period of heating that is very compact and very short and not lose a lot of dry matter and nutrients. Okay? Now, here's this example of an ideal fermentation, but let's see what happens after fermentation. So I just showed you that, okay? Now, what happens if I expose this material to air? Well, this fuels the growth of yeasts. The yeasts were asleep. They wake up because they see the air. The yeast eat lactic acid. Lactic acid, sugars disappear. Acetic acid goes down. And because lactic acid disappears, my pH goes back up. And my whole system is now here destabilized. I don't have a steady state simple system anymore. If I look at heating, I now get another round of heating that's occurring here. And that means that I have even more dry matter and energy that I'm losing from the system. So the loss of dry matter plus the loss of energy, because the CO2 is going up there, both of these are fueling that loss of dry matter and energy. I have another example of what happens when I have silages that are on the dry side. One of the things that's important is that we need to have enough what we call AW or metabolic water for the microbes that are doing the ensiling to actually live and survive and ferment. So if I don't, think about it. I have a windrow of alfalfa here. I have a windrow of alfalfa here. I wilt this to 40% dry matter, goes in the silo, it ensiles. I take this windrow and I make hay out of it, and it doesn't ensile, right? It's completely stable. But same bugs, same protein, same everything. Why doesn't the hay ensile? It's because it's too dry. There wasn't enough water for these bugs to actually ferment the dry hay. So that's why dry hay stays so stable. So again, as you start wilting material and it starts getting drier and drier, there becomes less and less what we call AW for these microbes to grow. So they have a harder time growing and a harder time of fermenting, and they ferment more slowly and they ferment to a lesser extent when the dry matter is high. So here's a curve of a pH drop. You can see that drop is kind of slow, right, compared to what I showed under ideal conditions. Here's the low pH. Look how fast and quickly that dropped. So slower rate of fermentation, and the extent of fermentation is not as quick, as big either. And then when I look at the heating that's occurring in the silo, high dry matter materials also have this tendency to heat for a longer period of time. And if that's making, you're losing heat and you're losing CO2, what are you losing? Dry matter and energy. Okay, so you can see the common theme there that's occurring, right? Okay, now another type of fermentation that occurs is this undesirable fermentations. It's called Clostridia. You know all that is. Let's see how that looks like. And you're going to see how different it looks to the ideal. So I'm just going to let this go. Whoa, that's really different too, right? But think about this. All the time that this is not in steady state, I'm like losing dry matter energy. I'm losing protein and amino acids because I get a lot of ammonia. I get butyric acid, which nobody likes and the cows don't like. And I'm losing dry matter and energy too, all right? So all of these poor fermentations that I've showed you, okay? So if you just forget about all of the details of all the gory things moving around and all these compounds, what's the take home from here? The take home is that these undesirable fermentations lead to a loss of money, right? That's the bottom line if you're the producer. So you can just do this is like, this is not new math. This is not calculus, right? You just take a loss of 10% of how many tons you're making, teeny farm, big farm, 10%, 15, 20%, put on whatever number you want. This is an old slide. I don't know what silage is going for anymore these days. $35 a ton of corn silage, okay? this is potentially how much money you're losing at these types of levels, you know? And John asked me, okay, well, you know, what's the shrink, you know? And I said 3 to 7, right? Because 3 to 7 is like a really good farm, right? On average, probably most farms are losing about 10% to 12% of their dry matter from the field to the bunk, to the cow, okay? So if you're at 15% or 20% and you put up this much amount of silage, I mean, that's a lot of money that you're dealing with. You know, can you then, if you were at 15, can you get to 10? If you were at 20, can you get to 15 or can you get to 10? So there's a significant amount that you're leaving on the table if you're managing this material poorly. And of course, the one thing that's not accounted for here, this is just your inventory loss. So especially at these high losses at the 15 to 20%, I can guarantee you that your nutritionist is probably rebalancing the diet, because that silage that's left over, all the good stuff is gone, like the previous speakers have talked about, right? So it's got less energy value, less protein. So what do you have to do? You have to rebalance the ration and feed more corn, feed more soy, backfill that. So that's going to increase your ration cost. And it also doesn't affect for losses in production, whether it be milk or gain. Because if your animals are eating less of this stuff because it doesn't taste good, it's low in energy, they're backing off on feed, that's going to cause you a production loss too. So it's, you know, you got to kind of have 3 strikes and you're out here, right? So you lost inventory, you lost performance, and your ration costs more. Like, that's a really sad story, okay? All right. So what can be done to lower these ensiling losses? You know, obviously follow these management recommendations that were talked about, you know, before me, like Becky talked about. But you can also use bacterial inoculants as a tool to help moderate or prevent negative effects of a slow fermentation, improve aerobic stability, so you have better shelf life, and then prevent a clostridial fermentation. So let's now talk about general types of inoculants. So there are 3 types of inoculants in general: the classical homolactic bacterial inoculants, which have quick starts at the front end of fermentation, making it fast. And remember, I said fast is better. These are Pediococcus species and Lactobacillus plantarum type of organisms. We then have the heterolactic acid bacteria that are primarily for better stability. They don't necessarily make fermentation faster, but they give the silage better shelf life in the bunk and in storage. These are the Buchneri organisms. There's some new organisms that are currently on the market or will be on the market depending on where you live. In Europe, Hilgardii has been improved. I understand that L-dialavorans has just been approved in the US by FDA. So these types of microorganisms give you better stability. And then the third category is actually a combination of putting classical homolactic and heterolactic together. And we're going to talk about today the classical homolactics, and we're going to talk about the dual purposes, okay? We're not going to try to tease out just the heterolactics by themselves. So the homolactic microbial inoculants really are control agents. They're, you know, probiotics in the silage, trying to get fermentation to be faster, lower, control the bad epiphytic microorganisms, reduce undesirable end products, reduce dry matter and energy loss, and result in basically better fermentations. So here's an example of triticale silage at low dry matter and high dry matter, you know, relatively speaking. So 25 is a little wet for me. 33 is probably a little bit better. So there are 2 dry matters of triticale here, and either uninoculated or inoculated, uninoculated or inoculated. This is the high dry matters, the low dry matters. So let's start off here. You can see the pH of the low control drop pretty quickly, right? But that low control, if it was inoculated in the green line, drops even faster, okay? But if you went to the high control here, look how slow that material is dropping. It's the same crop, just wilted a little bit longer, but the pH drops much slower because there's not enough AW there, or AW tends to be a little limiting. But then when you add an inoculant to it, wow, look how big the inoculant effect is with the higher dry matter. It's even better with the higher dry matter than with the low dry matter, okay? And then actually in that study, after 90 days of fermentation, what did we see? We actually saw that both control silages here that were control, either at the low dry matter and high dry matter, so even the 33% dry matter triticale went clostridial on us. But neither inoculated silages had butyric acid at all. So not only did this in this study, did that homolactic acid combination make fermentation faster and more efficient, it also prevented the clostridial fermentation from occurring. Okay. Here's a study, I think this was done in Italy, looking at a straight homolactic inoculant on triticale silage 2, and this was fed to brown Swiss heifers, but they looked at digestibility, and you can see both dry matter digestibility and crude protein digestion were significantly better in the inoculated silage. Okay, what about the dual purpose type of inoculants that I had just mentioned? Well, they're combining homolactics for speed of ensiling, and they're combining the heterolactics for better stability. And of course, the heterolactics there are added because they convert some lactic acid to acetic acid, which basically inhibit the yeast, which are the organisms that are blowing up our silage when they're exposed to air. And so here's a study looking at a dual purpose inoculant. So it had homolactic acid and heterolactic acid bacteria together. A lot of numbers here, but just look at the arrows. So the inoculated had better dry matter recovery, lower pH, that's good, that's good. Lactic acid was a little lower because there's more acetic. Because there's more acetic, we inhibited the yeast. So there's actually, sorry, this should be down. There's actually less ethanol, which is good because remember, if I have lots of ethanol, what does that mean that I'm losing a lot of? If you remember that table, you're losing a lot of dry matter, right? So I've got less dry matter loss here and aerobic stability significantly better. Another study out of the EU, fresh weight loss less, pH significantly lower, much less yeast, much less moles, and much better aerobic stability or shelf life, okay? All inoculants, almost all of them these days, all have some enzyme packages in them. They have some fibrolytic enzymes that are called xylanases and cellulases complexes. Some of them may have some amylase or starch degrading enzymes in them. The goal of putting some of these enzymes in is, for the most part, to try to give you a little bit more fermentable sugars for ensiling. And so the addition of these types of enzymes in our bacteria inoculants really may be more useful in crops that tend to be a little drier or tend to be a little mature and tend to be maybe a little short in that fermentable sugar category that you need to have these available for these microbes to do their ensiling efficiently. Okay, so there are a various number of factors can affect how well an inoculant works, and they are listed here, and I'm going to go through some of them right now. So how does storage affect an inoculant? Well, these organisms are pretty fragile. Excessive amounts of heat or moisture during storage will actually cause these microorganisms to die before you even mix them in the water and put them into your applicator tank. For inoculants that are stored frozen, they don't like to go under freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw cycles many times. So if you have an inoculant that the manufacturer says, you need to freeze it all the time, keep it frozen until you know that you need to use it. Don't take it out unthawed and then go, oh, I changed my mind, and put it back into the freezer again. That's going to really start killing these microorganisms. Does tank water temperature affect numbers of inoculant bacteria? No one talked about this until we started doing some work with this several years ago. The answer is a definitive yes, okay? So here's one of our first studies where this was just done in the laboratory. We just had inoculants, mixed them in water. We had like 6 different inoculants, A, B, C, D, E, F. We tested them at different temperatures. I'm just showing you the one set that was done at 104 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 hours. And then the temperature was dropped to 86 hours. So this is kind of like, okay, I'm out in the field chopping for 6 hours, stuff's heating up. And then it's the end of the day, okay, it's going to cool back down to like ambient temperature in the summertime, okay? In general, what you can see is that most of these inoculants, the numbers that are there are dropping, okay? And they're dropping a lot. A half unit drop here basically means that that inoculant becomes ineffective no matter how much you put on. So you don't need to go from 8 to 6.5 to make the inoculant ineffective. If you go from 8 to 7.5, that inoculant is ineffective. And how fast does that take? A couple of hours at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? At 104 degrees Fahrenheit, these bugs are dying, and they're dying really, really fast, okay? So then we just said, well, let's go out into the field and figure out what's going. And part of this data that I'm going to show you was we got help from Ron and Connie Kuber here in California. Well, I sent one of my graduate students to both Wisconsin and California, and she sampled something like 56, I don't know if the numbers are 56 tanks in the field where people were putting up silage live. And she got on farms in the morning, sampled these tanks, took the temperatures, took the ambient temperatures, looked at all the labels, did all the calculations. She had pre-poured Petri plates to do the yeast and mold counts. Not yeast and mold counts, but to look at the lactic acid bacteria counts in the tanks. And this is what she found. Okay, so this is a log scale of what is expected. More than expected, it would be above 0. Less than expected is below 0, okay? So the bottom line here is that if Michelle sampled a tank today and grew up the bacteria that she found that was in that tank, and if it met the specs that was supposed to be there based on what the label said to mix up in the guarantee, every single of these dots should be smack on that 0 line, meaning that what she thought was there was there. But in fact, look at the differences that are there and look at the trend of those differences going down like this and look at the temperature of the water in the tanks, Fahrenheit. And my line here means that anything at that line or below is ineffective. So from these 56 tanks, almost 30% of the farms were applying an inoculant that did nothing because the bugs were dead. And what was the highest correlation? It was dropping with temperatures. And you can see that this line here where it intersects and starts to drop is right at about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so because of that, that's a really important factor to think about when you're dealing with temperature. Yes.
I've got a question online about chlorinated water.
I'll be there in a second, okay? All right. Can water temperature be too cold? So we just asked, can they be too hot? And so for the most part, it's probably the answer is no for the most part, but sometimes I know guys are chopping and it's still, you shouldn't be chopping, but you're chopping because it is what it is. And you got to get the stuff off and it's freezing outside. But if the tank water starts to freeze up and if your lines start to freeze, that'll start killing some bugs too. And so that can be a problem. And so you can put in probably 1 to 2% propylene glycol. That'll keep it from the lines frosting on you, so that would help. And here's the take home with water temperature. The most of the high water temperatures that we found in the field, none of them were associated with what the ambient temperature of the day was. None of them. So it's not that these tanks and the water are getting hot because the sun's shining on it. It's because of where the tank was mounted on the chopper and it was getting heat from the motors or the exhaust. And if you look at almost all the choppers now, since we've done these studies, they've moved all the tanks out of the bodies of the choppers now so that most of these guys aren't picking up all that heat from the chopper, okay? So do not allow the water in the tanks to rise to more than 95 to 100 degrees. Don't mix up inoculants with hot water in the shop when you're preparing this stuff. I know guys that have done that. they'll get really hot water because they say it mixes better with hot water in. You're just killing all the bugs, guys, okay? And then do not let the water in the applicator tank to freeze, okay? How about chlorine and hydrogen peroxide? So chlorine is bad. For the most part, city water has pretty low chlorine, and if you get a drum of water, just leave it for overnight. Most of that chlorine will dissipate; it'll be gone. But freshly treated water with peroxide, if you're on a well, or if you just chlorine that well, this is not the water to use the next day. You want to test and make sure that you don't have that material killing your bugs. I will tell you that there is research from Europe that shows that, especially in really concentrated ultra-low volume applicator tanks like the Dormans, where you have a really high concentration of cell density but a very low amount of water, that type of mix is much more resistant to chlorine toxicity because of the cell counts being very high and the organic matter being very high as well. Okay, does location, like chopper versus silo, affect efficacy of your bug? Sure it does. You can't see this really well. Maybe it's better if you look at these pictures. But if I'm in Texas, I call this a California shower. If I'm in California, I call that a Texas shower, okay? But you basically don't want to do pull your forage box and turn the spigot on for 20 seconds or whatever it is and run your inoculant on top of the load and think that when it gets pushed up into the pile or to the bunk that it's going to be spread evenly. You think that happens? No, right? It just doesn't happen, folks. And so if you've got a liquid, inoculant you've got to put on, you got to put it on, at the chopper, not at the silo. How long can inoculants remain viable? Okay, so max of maybe 36, 48 hours, maybe 72 if the weather's kind of cool, but certainly less if the water is, getting really hot. Dry formulations in like Gandy applicators, again, 24, 48 hours. I mean, I see guys basically they have small farm, they'll have a Gandy box, half of got used in the last cutting, and what do they do with the rest that's in the Gandy box between second and third cutting? They leave it in there. And then what? You think that stuff's still alive a month later at the next cutting? Answer is no, right? It's gone. All right. Does the form of inoculant matter, dry or liquid, right? So let me show you real quick. This is alfalfa, 35% dry matter, drop in pH of the control, the liquid and the dry inoculant. Those things are right spot on. Same inoculant from the same company, but a dry versus a liquid applied formulation. Faster pH drop, quickly, better, right? But if I have the same crop, but I wilted it to 40%, now there's a difference. Slower pH drop because of lack of AW. The dry inoculant is better, but the liquid inoculant is even better than the dry. And that's because you've basically got your little bugs, that's your army that Becky talked about, right? And they're jumping into the desert to fight, but they're jumping into the desert to fight with little water packs on their back, right? And so they're going to get together faster, they're going to get to the beach faster, they're going to fight stronger, they're going to fight longer than if you don't give them any water to go fight in the desert. So if you've got a drier crop, the liquid applied inoculant is actually better. So here's some general uses for silage inoculants. And in the proceedings, I have a whole table of 10 or 12 different scenarios that you might be faced with. For example, I'm not going to go through all of those from a time standpoint. So I've kind of summarized that all down to one slide, which is not really easy to do. So this is certainly oversimplified, but small grains, grasses, alfalfa, if you're on the wet side, a good homolactic is good because these silages are going to ferment well. You want it to ferment quickly, drop the pH, and prevent the Clostridia from being there. If you start getting into the drier side, you might want to put the dual purpose on because you need not only help in the front end, but you need help for stability as well, okay? For, whole crop corn, Certainly dual purpose is the way to go, because one of the biggest problems in corn silage is not drop in pH, but it is aerobic stability, okay? And the same thing with high moisture corn, snaplage, earlage. There are some, you could probably get away with a dual purpose there, but there are also straight heterolactic products based on only L-buchneri and at a much higher dosage rate because it is very dry there and the bugs struggle to grow. That's when you need to really jam them in with some really good back-end help. Silage stored more than 9 or 12 months, dual purpose is good. If you have silages that are hot or TMRs that are hot, certainly put on something that is dual purpose, okay? So I'll just go through like one situation here because I don't want to, it's going to take me too long to go through all of them. And again, there's like 12 situations that are in the back of the proceedings. But here's like a situation one. Your silage is always fresh, okay? You never or seldom have heating TMR issues, even in warm weather. What's the inoculant you're going to choose? I'm going to put on a homolactic acid-based inoculant, okay? If I don't have heating, if even in the warm weather, my TMR doesn't blow up, I don't have hot silage ever coming from the face of the silage, it probably means that my back end is okay. And so I really need help in the front, but I don't need help in the back, okay? Here's just one more. Large bunker silo with a face that may be too wide that causes a slow feed out rate. What are you going to use? Here, I would do the dual purpose, buchneri with the homolactic. And it's because you're going to have better stability to withstand the stress of that aerobic exposure because you can't feed out fast enough, okay? So there's some other examples, like I said, in the proceedings. And I'm going to try to stay on time here and not go through all of these. Hey, last thing, can't choose between straight homolactic or heterolactic, then use the combo, okay? It's easy. And with my summary, bacterial inoculants, not a substitute for proper management. They can certainly help with efficiency and the value of your silages. You need to use best management practices to ensure the success of these inoculants. And such changes by using this type of a tool can really improve net farm incomes. Okay, and I think with that, here's my email if anybody needs to contact me. Thank you.
All right, we'll open up to questions.
So I'll start out. We've got one online here. I think it's a clarification from your slide earlier on the yeast fermentation. It says, how can we have 99% energy recovery with only 50% dry matter recovery? They'd expect the energy recovery to be 50% too. So I think they're asking for an explanation of that.
Yeah. So did that go through? Did I need to redo the question again? I guess everybody heard the question. Okay. So dry matter and energy, energy comes from the dry matter, but because ethanol is what we call a very reduced energy dense end product that captures the energy in it, the dry matter can actually go from carbon dioxide, but the energy value is still 99% and very, very high. And so that is actually a thing that can happen. You can have much more energy loss than dry matter in a system. They don't have to be in sync 50-50, 90-90, 80-80. It's just the way the chemistry works of what's left within it and what's dry matter. So you've lost a lot of dry matter that didn't have a lot of energy in it, but conserved all of the high amounts of energy in that ethanol. I don't know if that helped or not. I don't have off the top of my head, I can't think of a better way to explain it. And I know it may not make sense to people, but just believe me. Renato, you got a question? I don't know. That's a good question. What have you guys found? Oh, okay. So the question is, when you're making a liquid inoculant and mixing it with water, oftentimes people just get a whisker, or they just get like a paint, old paint thing and whisk it up. Or if you go in with a really high-speed drill with a propeller in the end, I think, is that basically the question? How does it affect the? Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. I would think that, as long as you weren't just blasting your whisker on a drill like super high speed, that it would probably be okay, because like we blend, even when we do our microbial analysis, we will blend that material in an osterizer at medium speed, which is pretty high. And we do LAB and yeast counts. And so we know that we're not killing the microorganisms with that degree of whisking. So I think it's probably okay. Yes.
What about UV exposure on the clear tanks, as you showed in the California's last texture shower?
So the question was, what about UV on the clear tanks affecting viability in the field? I don't have an answer to that. I would assume that the UV effect is probably minimal. The tanks are pretty thick, so you're probably not getting more than, I'm just guessing. I'm guessing you're probably not getting more than 20%, 15% of the UV rays actually making it through the thickness of that plastic in the tank, because even if it's clear, it's pretty thick, right? It's not a really thin layer. So if the heat's not getting through and really causing that tank to heat up, I don't think the UV is either. Yes.
You have a defining line between available water for fermentation and not enough, especially looking at like alfalfa.
Yeah.
Not by
Okay.
choice, but
Yep.
last several years we played around with the wet hay curing versus dry bale.
Yeah. Yep. So the question was, at what point does metabolic water become limiting and potentially like not even allowing fermentation to occur? Well, obviously that level is probably you're reaching there at about 20%, 15% moisture left. Then you're starting to get into the level where lactic acid bacteria probably are having a really hard time to ferment. So like basically getting to dry hay. But if you back off to like, high moisture, not high moisture, but high dry matter halages, once you pass about 40, 45%, especially in halages, you're really starting to affect the fermentation process. And every like 5% increase of dry matter, you get past about 35, 40%, that's going to really slow the system down a lot. And that causes problems, because not only is that higher dry matter material fermenting more slowly, it's harder to pack too. So you have more air trapped in the mass. So you have a system now that has more air, which is already a negative, and it's ensiling much slower, which is another negative, compounding those two factors together. So depending on what type of system you put it, now if you have a harvester system that has breather bags that are working, yeah, that's the key, right? And the system is intact, you can put up 65% dry matter alfalfa, and it'll ensile really well. But you try to put that into a bunk, I mean, good luck, right? It's never going to pack, and that thing will just burn on you probably, right? So I don't know. Did that answer the question? I mean, it just, the drier and drier it gets, the more challenging you're going to get. Now, one of the things that some people will do, depending on where they are, if they get caught and they get really dry, they'll chop a little bit finer. So they'll pull back chop length. But you have to now realize that, okay, I'm going to end up affecting my physically effective fiber down the line someplace. But the question is, hey, do I want to have really long chop length and effective fiber and have it blow, the whole thing blow up in the silo and lose it all? Or do I want to chop finer, get it packed finer, but realizing that I'm going to have a challenge with effective fiber, but at least I'm going to have good silage that I can live with, but I have to deal with that issue later on, right? So it's kind of a compromise there. Yes, one more. Yeah, so the question is, what impact does poor quality silage have in intake? The answer to that is it's variable, and it depends on how badly the silage is spoiled. And unfortunately, there is no ruler that we use in the field to say, okay, it's spoiled this much, you're going to have a drop in intake of 10%. Nobody knows what that number is, but in the studies that people have done, including myself and Keith Bolson before he had gone private, and I think you guys all know, sadly, that Keith passed away not recently, but Keith did pass away. But Keith had done work at Kansas where he fed the crust layer of a bunker silo, and even feeding like 10% of that to backgrounding steers whacked intake and whacked average daily gain. And I've done study in my lab where I fed dairy heifers total mix ration that was fed fresh, or the total mix ration that went overnight and heated and spoiled. And that caused about a 13% drop in dry matter intake. Even though if you looked at the crude protein, ADF, NDF, in vitro dry matter digestibility, starch digestibility, all those numbers didn't change in those two TMRs. What changed was the bad TMR had way more yeast and had much lower volatile fatty acids because of that, explosion of aerobic instability. Any other questions? I know I'm way over my time, so. Yes. I think okay, so the question was on farms that still have uprights, where's the inoculant going on? Is it going on at the blower, or is it going on in the field? I think it depends on the size of the farm and whether they've got a custom guy or not, right? So if they're custom, it's all coming in from the field. If not, it's really, really small farms, they're probably putting it on at the blower. I mean, if they don't want to carry it, they don't want to spend the money for the tank. And yeah, I mean, the first inoculant I ever put on in my life, I was at a blower with a 55-gallon drum with water, and I had my stopwatch on, and basically a Kmart watering can. And I knew that the wagon was bringing in, small, typical, 7-ton forage wagon coming in. I knew it was unloading in about 6-7 minutes. And so I knew how many tons were coming in, and I knew how much I needed how many gallons of water I needed to pour in. And you get really good, nice distribution because that blower is just volatilizing everything. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.